Welcome to the great data debate, everybody. Structure versus YOLO. I'm your moderator, Zack Martin. Let's get into it. Everyone today is being told to do AI, but once companies try applying AI to their internal data, they quickly realize that this is much harder than expected. That's led to a growing debate in the industry. Does AI need structured context and semantic understanding to work reliably? Or will future AI systems increasingly infer context on their own through exploration and iteration? Part of today's discussion is based on a theory that Benn has, that the idea is the eventual winners in AI may not be the companies building the most structure and governance, but the ones willing to move the fastest and let AI aggressively explore, iterate, and learn. Today, Benn will be arguing the side of the debate as a forward-looking theory about where AI could be heading, while Yoni will argue from the operational realities that enterprises are facing today around reliability, trust, and structure. Today's debate is about surfacing the real trade-offs companies are actively debating internally. So let's start with some brief introductions. Benn is the founder, CTO, and chief analytics officer of Mode, a collaborative BI platform designed to bridge the gap between data teams and business stakeholders. He also writes on Substack about various topics in tech and analytics, and I highly recommend you to check him out there. Yoni is the co-founder and CEO of Solid, a startup that aims to tackle the problems facing enterprises when you point AI at structured data. He also writes on Substack on the Solid Company Journey blog, and he hosts a podcast called Building with AI, Promises and Heartbreaks. Gentlemen, welcome. Let's start with arguments. Keep in mind throughout this whole thing, by the way, that both parties here are not 100% rigid in their positions. So this is just for fun. We're gonna dig into this. So Ben, I'm going to start with you. Your theory is essentially that companies are overthinking structure and governance, and that AI will increasingly figure out things on its own. Why do you believe that?
This seems to be kind of what's happened with like all AI things over the last few years. I mean, I think so. So you could sort of, it's like a squint at it version of the bitter lesson. It's not really the bitter lesson because the bitter lesson is much more of like add a bunch of compute and things solve themselves. But if you think about how like AI, like how we started using AI tools 2, 3 years ago, a lot of it was like weird prompt engineering hacking, things like I'll pay you $100 if you work extra hard and do this thing, and it would like do different stuff. Um, there were things like planning mode in some of the beginning early like agentic coding tools where you'd have to go through this big long planning process. If you used Cursor early on, there were a lot of times where you'd be like, choose which files to add into the context of the little sidebar chat to be like, all right, use this file or use this file or use these lines of code. And that's like the stuff that gets injected into the prompt. And over time, all of those things have sort of started to fade away. That increasingly it's much more of a you just tell it what you want it to do and it goes and figures out how to do it. Some of that is because the models have gotten better, where they're much more capable of like you don't need to bribe them to do the right things. They're much better at following instructions. They're much better at kind of like one-shotting stuff. Some of it is because of the harnesses have gotten a lot better, where they're able to basically like loop over themselves and do their sort of internal reasoning. Part of the internal reasoning is the model. Part of the internal reasoning is the harness itself, like reflecting on its own output. And a lot of it is actually just search. A lot of it is that like some of the things that the harnesses and things like Claude Code have gotten very good at is just search. Where if you're using Claude Code or Cursor to say, hey, go make some updates to some code base, it will search through the code base and find the things that it needs. And so you don't need to give it specific context on what to do. Like it will sort of explore that on its own. It doesn't seem weird to me that like data problems would follow that same pattern. That part of that is because that seems the way that all these systems are working. And part of that is also, that is what analysts do. Like if you think about how we do this job as a person, a lot of it is, okay, I'm getting asked a question. I don't really know what the answer is. Let me go read some docs. Let me go explore this thing. Let me go see what's been done before. Let me kind of collect all this stuff together into my like working memory of what I think is going on. All right, I'm going to like take those notes. I'm going to try a thing. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to reflect at it and see like, does this look reasonable? There are obviously things about that are hard for like AI to do. And sometimes maybe there may be like part of an analyst job is you might go ask a question and be like, does this look right? And you're like, no. And you have to go back and figure it out. And so I'm not sure how like one-shottable all that really is. Though again, how one-shottable is like building operating systems in one prompt. And now all the labs have their little like blog posts about how they've done this. That's obviously a slightly different thing, solving a data problem. But still, the point is that like if you try to make an AI system act more like an analyst, it starts to look a lot like the way that the coding harnesses work, which is they just search, they develop their own plans, they piece together things, they put together kind of a composition of this final piece of work. And you can do all of that without a ton of structure underneath it. You need context. You do need information about how a business works and stuff like that. But that doesn't necessarily need to be like the traditional semantic layer that we have always thought of it. It doesn't necessarily need to be everything is like designed in kind of proper functions. It can just be, hey, that information needs to be out there somewhere where I can find it in a reasonable way. And again, it's annoying for people to do that because you kind of got to dig through a bunch of files and read a bunch of stuff and we're slow at it. But if you're a computer and you can do this stuff really quickly, like it's not that bad. And so it seems very possible to me that sort of enabling these things to just explore and figure out things on their own actually may be much more promising than trying to give them kind of like the very structured semantics that we have given very different looking computers to be able to basically take a question and transform that into a formula. Like that's not really what these things are trying to do. And so it makes sense to me that they would potentially have a different set of like context. Again, there needs to be something underneath them, but a different set of context underneath them than what we have traditionally given like a classic BI tool or whatever. The last point I'd make, which I will we can come back to later, is part of this I think is also changes the ways that we interact with data. That if we were trying to just replicate like a BI tool on top of data with AI as the intermediary instead of a draggy droppy Tableau style thing or whatever, I don't think that we would do that without a semantic layer. But if we're just trying to answer questions, if we're just trying to understand our business, then we may do that pretty differently if the intermediation is an AI system as opposed to like a deterministic draggy droppy piece of software. And so that's part of the reason also is I think like a less structured system underneath like an AI intermediation might make a lot more sense than a less structured system under a drag and drop Tableau style, like classic BI type system.
Great. Yoni, over to you. What do you think Ben is underestimating here?
Well, first of all, I agree with a lot of what Ben says. Personally, I use Cursor all the time to do all kinds of little projects. Even over this past weekend, was helping my wife create illustrations for a children's book using Cursor actually, because ChatGPT wasn't able to cut it. And so I use it a lot. I understand what Ben is describing in terms of the capabilities of AI, and I've been living it. I think one of the things we always need to keep in mind is what is our tolerance for mistakes or for the AI going in the wrong direction, right? Because if we're creating illustrations for a children's book, which is what I did over the weekend, risk tolerance is pretty high. It's the worst case is it instead of drawing me bald with a beard, it draws me, with hair, and then it's like, oh, we need to fix that, right? Um, but also, a lot of the code that I build, the risk is not that high because I don't build production code within the solid platform. In the world of data, analysts are quite concerned, and rightfully so, about producing the wrong results, right? When I talk to analysts, they say, when I work on something, I don't YOLO it. I investigate, I try to figure it out. I write queries, I pull data, I look at it, I try to see, does this make sense? I might even go to someone else, a more senior analyst or my team manager and ask them what they think. Especially if the request came in from a high-ranking business executive. So the first question that needs to be asked is, what is our risk tolerance? If we're fine with AI sort of botching it along the way and stumbling upon walls and so forth, that's fine, for very simple questions. But if it's a high-ranking business executive asking questions and asking for an analysis, that's different. If you're thinking about reporting this publicly, whether it's the stock market or to regulators or whatever it may be, risk tolerance is very, very low. And so that's the first thing that we need to think about. Another thing that we need to think about is, Ben said sort of AI can sort of figure out on its own and behave like a human. A human is searching and trying to explore the different alternatives they have. AI is doing the same thing. One of the things that I noticed in our work with customers is that in many cases, even the humans can't figure it out. Even the humans can't search for the data. They don't know where it is. They'll look at a table and say, I think this is the right table to use. I think this is the right column to use. And they'll still go and ask other people and try to find the one person in the entire company that knows what this table does. So if humans are struggling to find who owns certain data and what can I do with this data and what am I allowed to do with it or not, and what questions I can ask or not, I find it harder to believe that AI would be able to figure it out on its own entirely. And so, for those reasons, I think it is very important to give it some structure, to involve the people that know the data and help them build guardrails for the AI. There was a recent blog post by the guys at DBT. There's Jason there who runs their developer relations and another blog author. And he wrote about comparing sort of the YOLO approach of text to SQL and just letting AI write its own SQL based on what it can see from the data versus letting a semantic layer do it. And what they proved was that the semantic layer resulted in much higher accuracy of responses. And also, it resulted in guardrails in the sense that there were questions that were not possible to answer. And the semantic layer said, I don't have that data. We can't pull that data. That's not a metric we can calculate. And I think that's important. So it's not just a matter of can AI generate the responses and can AI run the calculations? It's also can we block AI from doing things it shouldn't be doing? And I'll give you an example. Last week, I was working on a project, and this was a completely new workspace in Cursor. And I asked it to do something. And then, I went about my business and I came back and it did everything. And I said, wait, there's something that doesn't make sense in what just happened here. It accessed the system that it doesn't have the credentials for. I said, this is very weird. I mean, obviously it didn't hack it. So what happened here? So I asked Cursor, how did you access the system? And he said, I didn't. I said, no, 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 you did. I see the results. You did. I said, oh yeah, you're right. I did. What I did was I grepped through your entire home directory and I found an env file with a token. And it was like, oh, let me try this token. And you look at that response and you say, oh my God. So I think AI is very, very capable and I experience it on a daily basis and I love it. I think for the purpose of data and analysis, where our risk tolerance is lower and lower, we need to give this thing guardrails and we need to make sure that it's within that sort of path that we want it to be for it to be successful, for people to be able to rely on it and for businesses to really, really benefit from it.
Perfect. Thank you both for that. All right, we're going to get into the meat of it. Those were good opening arguments. Ben, if AI can increasingly figure out things on its own, why are so many enterprise AI initiatives struggling today? What's your take on that?
So a couple answers to that, and somewhat related to what Yoni was saying. Partly my answer is because they're too timid. Like that if you think about some of the stuff that's been really successful, like some of the AI products that have been really successful, and maybe not necessarily successful, like some of these have been successful in ways where they like maybe are useful or not, but were things that like blew up, things that people really wanted to try out, and like you wouldn't say were failing products. A lot of them were ones that push boundaries. Like Google built Google built basically ChatGPT internally. They had a thing, they invented the whole thing. They built that internally. Like, we can't release this because it might make stuff up. And then OpenAI is like, nah, whatever. What if we just put it out there and people will use it? And it did make a bunch of stuff up, but people are like, this is pretty crazy. There was a very obvious thing you might do there, which is like, what if you just have it talk to itself and like loop in a circle every time it produces something and reason about it? And initially for like coding problems, the first version of this was basically the first big one was Cursor. It didn't do that. It was just like, again, give it the context. It'll try to solve the thing. It'll show you a diff. You get to very carefully like review or say like accept, reject, whatever. Claude Code was the one that was kind of like, what if you YOLO it? Like, what if you just don't care and you don't even bother looking at the code and you say like, does it work in the end? And eventually, like, not only did that thing really popular quickly, but like it worked pretty well. Things like Claudebot or OpenClaw or whatever it is, there was a version of that too, where it's like, what if you give it to Yoni's story? What if you give it access to everything? What if you just have this thing run 24/7, give it access to everything, have it constantly wake up and do stuff? This wasn't like a non-obvious thing to do. There were a lot of people who were trying to build like that exact same thing. A big part of the reason why that one probably was the one that blew up was because it was the one that like took all the guardrails off and didn't worry too much about security and didn't worry too much about like, how do we make sure it doesn't hallucinate? How do we make sure it's like, nah, what if we just take all these things off and see where it goes? I'm not saying those are the things that like necessarily are the final version of this, but if you think about why couldn't we get personal assistance right, and whether or not Claudebot or whatever is the right one, I don't know. But Why was there so slow progress on that initially? And then Claudebot was this big step forward. I think it was because it turned the dial up really far and then tried to figure out where do you step back. And that's ultimately how you figure out like the right way to do this. Whereas if you're very cautiously taking each step forward, where it's like, okay, we have to give it access to just this thing and just this way so it never messes up. Like if everything is ask for permission first before asking for forgiveness, you're going to make really, really slow progress. Now, granted, I think like, can you do that in some enterprise setting? Probably not. But that to me is still part of why this has been so slow, is because they are sort of partly just like constitutionally this way to be like cautious about this stuff, and partly because a lot of enterprises need to be that way and they can't just turn the dial to 11 and see what happens. Um, that said, and this I think gets a little bit to the thing you were saying before, Yoni, about like how do we make sure these things are right? Sometimes like, how do you make sure they're not making stuff up when analysts have to go off and do all this whole process? The question I would have on that is when you ask an analyst a question and they have to go do all this research, they're not using structured semantic layers to answer those questions. Like, how do you know they're right? Like, you kind of just have to work with them on it. You kind of, part of it is that they're not doing it. So you know that like the expectation is maybe they get it wrong. Now you'll go yell at them if they do or whatever. But like, part of the work that they give you when they're saying like, I am trying to find some frontier insight that I haven't looked up before, is you have to have this expectation that this might be wrong. And I don't think we quite have that with computers. It's weird when you open up a BI tool and you're like, did this thing do the math wrong? I don't know, maybe. Like you're not going to ever bother to check that because you assume the computer did the math right. If you ask a person, you kind of accept that there's some error tolerance here because you know they might do it wrong or they may have looked up the wrong thing or whatever. And I think like part of this is it's changing the expectation of the system might get it wrong, and that's okay. Like if we expect them always to be right, yeah, then it's going to be like a really slow road where we're adding all of these context and all of these semantic layers and adding all of these guardrails because we expect that it can never be wrong. If we change our expectation and treat it more like we might treat an analyst, where it's like, do your best. I'm going to look at it. If it's not right, I'll give you feedback or we'll talk about it or whatever. But like, I accept that you're pushing a boundary and trying to find something that's never been found before. Then I think that like opens up a lot more possibility when you don't treat it necessarily as like it always has to be exactly right.
All
Which
right, Yoni.
is sort of a balance then of like, I do think if you want to be reporting to the SEC, like our exact revenue numbers, yeah, you can't YOLO that. But like, there's a lot of questions that we don't need to do that with. We're just trying to understand what's going on in a business. And in those cases, there, I think, can be more tolerance for YOLOing than a lot of businesses have.
Great. Yoni, what's your response to that?
So you're talking about people being too timid, and I agree. You sometimes need to take all those guardrails off and let it run. I think when you look at it from the perspective of enterprises, and we usually at Solid, we usually work with larger enterprises, regulated, finance, insurance, healthcare, and so forth. Even my own personal money is in a bank that is a user of Solid. It's kind of crazy to close that loop. Um, and when you look at it from their perspective, they think they're actually running very fast because if you look at enterprises historically, like let's go back, 15 or so years, cloud was starting, S3 came out, EC2 came out, and banks would not touch cloud with a stick. They looked at it and say, I'm never going to put my data anywhere in the cloud. That's crazy. That's somebody else's computers. Never going to happen. Fast forward to 2026, not only is there data in the cloud, they are all these organizations are running as fast as they can towards AI. It's so different to how cloud was. So I think from their perspective, they are running much faster with somewhat less controls and less timid than they ever were before. So maybe it's a matter of perspective. And there's a thing that kind of sort of sits in my mind a lot. The concept of semantic layers has been around for decades. And the only people who cared about semantic layers historically were people who were very, very deep into the data. These were data leaders, data engineers, BI people who were building, in SAP business objects or Tableau or, whatever technology it might be. But only they care about semantic layers. And what I noticed was happening over the past year and a bit is that all of a sudden, everybody cares about semantic layer. Even Mark Benioff from Salesforce, he was on an interview last week, and he talked about semantic layers. And that kind of like blows your mind because you say, okay, people realize that semantic layers are the key to making AI and data work well together. And they're key to finding that balance between running as fast as we can as an enterprise but also still anchoring the results in reality, creating something that's reliable and trustworthy. Um, and I think there's one other piece here. So when I use Cursor directly, I know how to code. So when Cursor does weird stuff on me, I can catch it. I can look at it and say, this doesn't make sense. But if I am an executive at a bank and ask a question like, how many of the people who are using our savings products uh, withdraw from the savings products and send it to another bank? If let's say I ask that question, this is a real question. Let's say I ask that question, and the thing comes back with an answer. I, as a business executive, I don't know how to vet that answer other than this feels right or this feels wrong, which they do anyway. But I don't know how to vet that thing. I don't know how to look at the SQL query and say, the AI did the right thing or not. And so I think that's one big distinction. As a direct user of Cursor, I can validate what it does. Business executive that, put in a question into some chat or some agent or whatever and got some result, I think they have a very hard time vetting it. So, Ben, you mentioned sort of that as a thing they can do. I don't know if they can.
I'm gonna back up to the necessity of semantic layers, Yoni. So if the semantic layer is necessary, why has it been building it? Why has building it been so historically slow and painful?
Oh, it's terrible. It's you know so a semantic layer, if you think about it, is just like you would have Google Translate without any of the dictionaries yet, right? So you have the capability to translate between business concepts and data concepts, but none of the actual content of how to actually do that. And so teams needed to do that by hand, and doing it by hand takes forever. So I think, sort of to Ben's point, if doing it by hand takes forever, maybe we just YOLO it and give it a try so that we can run a lot faster. The thing I noticed recently is I'm gonna cheat a bit and I'm gonna share a screen. Um, but this is the Google Trends for the term semantic layer. Okay, and again, the term semantic layer has been around for decades, but look what happened over the last year and a half. You can ignore this is May, so obviously, May the data isn't calculated yet, but look at what happened over the last year and a half. And all of a sudden, everybody realized that semantic layers are the way to enable it. YOLOing maybe is an extreme case, but being able to generate reliable data, reliable results using our enterprise data is now possible. And the key to doing that is semantics. The challenge, of course, at that point becomes, okay, how do I generate all these semantics? How do I build all this stuff? Which, in our case, and I'm not going to try to make this an ad for Solid, this is something that we automate because it's really, really hard to do. To Ben's point, it's hard to do that stuff. And I would almost advocate that um, if we sort of narrow the challenge to focusing on generating semantics, it's possible that we can take Ben's approach to generating semantic models and feeding that into semantic layers, and then the semantic layer becomes the thing that the AI relies on versus doing it by hand or using Solid as a product to generate the semantics. So maybe that's sort of a compromise between the way I'm looking at it and the way Ben is.
So okay, so I have a question there actually. There's a kind of a nuance here that I think is an important thing to figure out that I'm not actually sure. I'm not sure exactly where you would come down on this. So one, I agree with you too. It's weird how like semantic layers have become this thing of like, oh, it's an AI thing. Like there was like an information article last week, I think, about like Microsoft basically not allowing direct access to the Power BI semantic layer, but like the headline was like new front in AI war. And it's like it's actually just like some Power BI semantic. It's like what in the world? Um, so okay, so traditionally, if you think of a semantic layer as it works with respect to a BI tool, it is the only way the BI tool interacts with the underlying data. Like it's kind of a forced formula layer essentially. It's like, all right, if I want to say revenue, then therefore this thing will get processed through a semantic layer that requires me to compute revenue in a certain way. Great. The problem with that and part of the reason we built Mode the way we did historically was two things. One, it was, as you said, it was expensive to build. Take some time. Okay, say we can solve that. The second problem was it was very restrictive of the kinds of questions that you could ask because you had to have pre-modeled the thing in the semantic layer to answer it. And so you could run really quickly in a way if you had a semantic layer because you could like ask any question it allowed you to answer, but it never allowed you to offer it. Like it was just you had to drive on the highways. And ultimately, like how fast can a business run if they exclusively ask questions on the highways? I don't know, like not maybe kinda, but I'm not totally sure that this question of like this bank, it's sort of pre-modeled, but even in that like how many people did X and then did Y and what percentage of this, there is also sort of a subsequent calculation that happens after that that is like sort of a post semantic layer computation of do the division right or whatever, or exclude this or whatever. Like the semantic layer does not guarantee that question gets it right. It guarantees potentially like revenue's the right idea of revenue, but it doesn't guarantee sort of the sort of final mile. The question I would have then is your contention that like AI needs a semantic layer, as in AI is a BI tool. It queries data via a semantic layer. Like it does not write SQL. It does not like touch data any except through like a semantic layer API that makes very structured requests. Or is the semantic layer simply documentation? Like, is a semantic layer like, oh, here is a YAML file that explains how you should write a query, or you can use some API. Like you could certainly imagine Cursor or Claude Code or Codex or whatever, ingesting a bunch of semantic YAML and being like, write the query as it so it is consistent with the semantic YAML. Or you could imagine it being like, you have to write a query via like the API that this thing allows. And if you ask anything that is not within the bounds of that semantic layer, like you can't ask that question. And so I think those are two pretty different systems. The first one to me is like, yeah, okay, that's structured context. It doesn't need to be a semantic layer in a traditional sense. It could just be like, markdown or whatever. But it's like write down what the data means versus the semantic layer itself is governance because you cannot actually access it outside of the semantic layer, like the API that semantic layer provides.
Yeah, it's a great distinction. I was on a call earlier today, this time with a healthcare user of ours, and the head of business data there. So she manages the business side of using data. She doesn't write SQL. Her team doesn't write SQL. She looks at it from that perspective. And she said on the call, she said, one of my concerns is that the semantic stuff is going to limit me and my team and my business stakeholders, just like our current BI limits us. Use BI, everything's modeled in there. And she said, I can't, like, if I want to ask questions that are outside this BI, I'm stuck. I can't go anywhere. So if the semantic layer thing is too much of a guardrail, then I'm still stuck. What did you solve for me? And it's a very valid question. I think one of the limiting factors historically was at what pace, at what speed can you generate these semantics, right? So
Mhm.
every time somebody had a request, there was some BI developer that needed to sit down and build more semantics and do it by hand, and it would take forever. And I think one big advantage we have now with Cursor and Claude Code and technologies like Solid, et cetera, is that we can build semantics much faster than we could in the past. So I foresee this becoming less of a limiting factor. If a certain organization could only produce, let's say, I'll just make up a number, 2 models a month in BI, now maybe they can produce 30 models a month or 100 models a month because there are these technologies that accelerate it. And by doing that, you have less of a limiting factor when you're asking these questions. I will say that I did, your proposal about using YAMLs, I tried it, and it mostly works, except sometimes when the AI is overzealous, a bit like what happened to me with the key that it took from another end file that I mentioned earlier. AI doesn't always listen to what's in your YAML or in your instructions. And you will write in all caps, only use the YAML. And it'll be like, yep, I understand. And then we'll go and not use the YAML. So I think maybe that's something we'll solve over time as well, at least keeping AI to doing what we told it to. And maybe that will make the YAMLs a more plausible approach. And maybe that'll be solved in 6 months because things are going so rapidly. I guess until then, we need to find a way for not allowing AI to do things that we don't want it to. Just like, I use Waymo all the time. I don't want Waymo to be like, oh, there's a new road there. Never seen it before, but looks like a road. Let me go that way. I don't want
Well,
that.
let me pose this question to Ben then. Would you trust AI making important business decisions without structured context?
No, but well, like it depends on the decision. And I think that I like yes, in a way, in that I don't do I trust it to report exactly the right number? Not really. Do I trust it to like ultimately come to a reasonable conclusion that's probably pretty good? Yeah, I actually kind of do trust that. Like, and I think that's kind of the distinction, which is if you are just trying to, if you're saying like, to your point about a bank, if you are a bank and you need to know how much money is in everybody's account, and like I got to keep that ledger because like that is my business, is keeping like that spreadsheet is my business. Yeah, no. Do I trust AI to keep that spreadsheet? Absolutely not. Do I trust AI to say like read this spreadsheet and find some business opportunities for me based on this, that, and the other? Or like, does it seem as though my bank is succeeding with senior citizens or college students? Figure that out. Like, I trust it to answer that question reasonably well. I trust it as well as I would probably trust an analyst, and I don't think it needs structured data for that. And so, like, it's do you trust it to like land the airplane? Not exactly. Do you trust it to like do some of the more semi-creative work like that an analyst would do? Yeah, I think I would. The one to your point of like the Waymo just veering off the road that the road's not there. I think the thing that makes us uncomfortable about it is exactly that. It's like it's the tungsten cube problem is the way I've referred to this before, where Claude had like, we're going to run this like weird like a vending machine or whatever that's going to be run by AI. It's going to be a business. It's fully like autonomous AI, whatever. And it's like, how did it do? It didn't do great. Like it lost some money, but it like came off the rails in extremely bizarre ways. And I think it's like that makes us it unnerving, where it's like a human would never. So the tungsten cube thing was like the vending machine started like ordering people like $1,000 tungsten cubes for free because someone like convinced it to do this. Now, granted, these are a bunch of like Anthropic employees that are like intentionally trying to be very difficult to this thing to see what it would do. But like they made it do a very strange thing that no human at all would have ever done. However, it probably makes some very smart decisions that humans would not have figured out either. And so I think it's like it's this weird, like everybody has this sort of like jagged intelligence thing. I think it's like a weird sort of intelligence that can be very, very dumb in weird ways. And I think that makes it unnerving that like the Waymo could just suddenly decide, actually, I'm going to like take a hard left into a lake. Like why? I don't know. Cause like something happened that did a human will never do that. No, will the human crash more often in Waymo? Yeah. But like in a way that we kind of come to understand. And I think there's something more comforting in that. Like the vending machine will never order tungsten cubes. Okay, it may like still go to business or do something stupid, but like it won't go be stupid in a way that seems so nonsensical we can't understand it. And so I think it's like that effect that makes it unnerving for business decisions. Again, where the business decision is not how much money is in Yoni's bank account today and tomorrow, and like, please don't do that math with AI.
So
Yeah.
Yoni, thinking about that, where does that risk become kind of unacceptable in your eyes? Because there's obviously risk, but
I
where does it?
agree with Ben. I agree with Ben on the point of we maybe it's in a part of it is an alignment of our expectations, right? We to Ben's point, Waymo is way more way safer than a human driver. I would put my kids in a Waymo more than I would put them as me in the driving seat even, right? I think Waymo is for sure safer than me and my wife driving the car, hands down. Obviously, these weird behaviors cause us a pause. Waymo did a U-turn here in the Bay Area, a U-turn where you're not allowed to even, I think, turn left at all, and was stopped by a police officer that was amazed to see that there was nobody in the car, and he didn't even know what to do with it. Because actually, under California law at that time, now you can, but at that time, you couldn't even cite a Waymo because there's no one to cite. So what do we do with it? And yeah, and this is Waymo stats. So Waymo is much safer than me driving or my wife driving, and maybe you two as well. But there's this reset in our minds where we need to be able to trust the machine more and be okay with it making mistakes that we don't anticipate anyone making. So I very much agree with that. And I think after we start resetting that, we will feel more comfortable doing certain things. So maybe if I sort of take Ben's approach and my approach here, it kind of depends on your risk tolerance and your willingness to accept things that you can't anticipate at all in terms of behavior of the system. And then if you are in the right frame of mind for that, then this approach could work. Then the approach of YOLO could work. And if you're not, if you're saying, okay, no, I need more rigidity to Ben's point, I do need the semantic. So I guess it's not one or the other. It's more the different tools and different technologies and different approaches depending on what you're actually trying to solve for.
And I think that to me is part of the YOLO to analyst version of this is it's an expectation thing. It's like we think of, I'm going to ask a computer a question and it better give me the right answer. Like it's weird to imagine like the thing just doing the math wrong. But we have places where we do this. Like very much when Google first came out, everybody's like, don't trust everything you read on the internet. Like, be careful about it. And like, there are people who sort of were like, it was novel too. That you'd be like, well, I found it on Google, so it must be true. And like now we all have a very like built-in expectation of exactly what comes out of Google. Like we know how to trust it. We sort of know how to eyeball it. We know how like a sense of what's right or not what's wrong. Like obviously, like we don't always get it right, but like people have a pretty good intuition for figuring that out now. And so I'm not necessarily sure that we'd have the same intuition about like to Yoni's point of like, here's a chart, is it right or wrong? Like there is no real intuition of that behind. You can't look at a chart and know if it's right or wrong unless you have like a lot of intuition about what the thing is trying to tell you. But the point is like we have come to trust a system in like Google as being like not infallible. Like we understand this is a computer, but it's a computer that's doing a certain thing, and sometimes that will produce weird answers, and we have to kind of like use our own judgment to do it. And I think there's very much an element there too, where it's like we have thought of data work and sort of the computer side of data work, like the thing that the technology does is being the part that is infallible, and then like the humans have to be the judgment. And I don't know that necessarily has to be that way. Like it may also be that there's some judgment in what the computer has done too, and we just have to have like the same sort of intuition and judgment that we apply to that we would with other things.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because we have a great discussion, but we're quickly moving through time, and we want to also get to our audience Q&A as well. So I'm going to go into the kind of the more practical side of this thing and get your guys' opinions on this. So by the way, I have to say there's a lot more agreement between you two than I originally expected to get into this. So it's very interesting. Ben, where does the YOLO style approach work really well today in real organizations?
Uh, I don't know that it does. There are so I think it works really well on stuff that starts unstructured. Because we don't have this idea of like we sort of understand what we're getting at when we talk to that. So an example of this where I was talking to someone like a CEO not that long ago about something like this, where CEO of a pretty big company, it was internal surveys. It was they run internal surveys on like engagement surveys and stuff like that. So it's like, you send out a survey to all your employees. It's like a bunch of Likert scores of like, do you feel like your work has meaning? Or like, do you like your manager? Or do you feel like you understand the mission? Whatever. And then there was like comments. And the thing that he said was, he was like, look, this stuff is useful, but really I just like, and we do a bunch of analysis on it and all that. What I want is just like take all of the information from the feedback that people write and just like stuff it into an LLM and like, let me ask questions of that. Let me have the thing read all of the things that people say and let me understand the things they're saying. Cause like, I trust that honestly more than I trust kind of like the quantified version of that feedback. And I trust it more than the sort of like the analysis that we do of like people in this department rank engagement at a 4.3 and they rank it at a 4.8 in this other one or whatever. Like he basically was just like, I just want to know what people say. Give me like the words out of their mouth and then have this thing. The company had like 1,000 employees or something. So it's like too many things to read all of them, but it's like, I basically want to read all of them, but like give me a summarized version of all of them and tell me what I need to know. And so I think it works really well in those places because we kind of understand if we have a bunch of meeting transcripts, we have a bunch of call recordings, we've got a bunch of like that kind of feedback. We don't have a clear way to structure it. If we do, it's like very lossy because it's like do some sort of is this positive or negative sentiment, stuff like that. And so people are just like saying, take the unstructured stuff and feed it into the LLM and like there's a bunch of sort of new age CRMs or whatever that are these kinds of things that are basically like taking all the call transcripts, ingesting them and being like, these are the customers you need to talk to. And this is the most important stuff. And that stuff seems to work reasonably well because it's not we don't think of that as like, is this metric right? We basically think of that as like, did it properly capture the vibe? And that's like a pretty impactful thing to be like, here's the vibe and here's like 3 citations of a particular call from a customer where you can read a quote that does it. Like that's how CEOs often are making decisions anyways. They'll hear a thing from a customer and it's like, oh, I have this thing in my head now. It's like the only thing I can think about. And so I think places like that where we're not going from what we typically expected to be structured, like quantified metrics into something that's more YOLO-y and vibey has been pretty successful because we don't have to like make that. It's not a transition. It's just like, this is a net new thing and this is the way that we consume it.
Awesome. Yoni, do you agree with that?
In that case, it makes sense. And I might even take it a step further. And I'm putting aside for a second the the privacy side of things.
Mhm.
But imagine that your LLM didn't just review the survey responses, but also looked at how people were interacting on a daily basis, right? Let's say it looked at all the public Slack channels in the company, and then all the emails that were, broad distribution, et cetera. So nothing personal, no DMs, but that. And it looked at that, it could probably augment it. It could probably say, well, people said this in the survey, but actually observing your public channels, there is, I don't know, some level of toxicity in the sales channel because they tend to communicate in a certain way, or there's some level of, I can see AI doing that, and I can see AI doing that well and being able to come back and point you to things and say, listen, these are things you should look at, not just the feedback people gave you, but also here's the real stuff. Here's an analysis of what's actually happening. And we could never do this before because it was too much work. Even if you were building models and NLP and stuff like that, it was still too much work. And now you can just take Cursor and be like, hey, here's a token to our Slack workspace. Go through all the public channels. Actually, I should do this maybe. Go through all the public channels and tell me what you think about the culture in our company. It can do that. So I think those use cases, they're definitely achievable today.
And there's an interesting thing there with as it sort of cross, as you said, like kind of doing both of those sides of it, where it's like develop your own hypothesis about these things, then go confirm them. Try to come up with a thing that says like, is this true or not? And ultimately, like I think one of the really hard things about using AI for any sort of data work is because you can't know if it, like the only way to know if it's true is if you look at what it did. Like if you use AI to build software, you can click on the buttons, and if you click on the buttons enough, you'll know if it works or not. And like, yes, there's security and there's privacy and there's things like that, but like ultimately there's still problems that are on the external part of the software. Like they are things that the black box can remain a black box forever. If you never can actually like see any problems on the outside of it, then there's no problem. You don't care how the inside works. With like data, that's not true because like the chart's the chart, and the only way to know if the chart's right is if you look at the numbers. Like maybe it multiplied the number by 2. You'll never know unless you look at the code to see if it multiplied the number by 2. The one maybe exception to that is if you see a trend, like does it emerge in other places too? It's like you actually can't look at a number and know if that's true. The way that you sort of confirm a chart yourself, the way you confirm that semantic layer chart from like Yoni about the Google Trends, isn't like I go look at the code. It's kind of like, does that square with every other thing that I've seen? And does it match the evidence in other places and all those sorts of things? And so I think like AI could also kind of do that of like do the work, answer the question in 5 different ways. If all of them kind of tell the same story, it's probably right. Like that's ultimately how we're doing it anyway. There's not going to be like, it's very hard to be like, this is 100% accurate on any sort of data work. It's all this kind of like you're looking at it from a bunch of angles and seeing if it's right. And AI can do stuff pretty quickly and look at stuff from a bunch of angles. And so I don't know. I could see that being a way to solve that problem.
Yeah, I can even see maybe, you ask the same question. You ask Cursor, clock, whatever. You ask the question, it spins up 5 different agents, maybe even running 5 different LLMs behind the scenes. Lets them all run and then compares the results of them to see if they consolidate on the same answer or not. It's I think that's a valuable approach.
Yeah, which also who knows, like I'm sure these things are all like act somewhat the same, and they probably all have like if they get it wrong, they might get it wrong in the same ways, and they're not exactly, I'm sure there's problems with all sorts of weird like
Yeah.
confounding problems there. But anyway, who knows?
I'll
All right.
say that from my perspective, Zach, you didn't ask this, but at least I'll share it. Um, the approach that Ben shared is great and works right now for that semantic the analysis of the text and trying to understand what's going on in there. What I'm seeing with users of Solid and also not users of Solid who are using semantic layers, they're able to actually generate more precise results, at least for the perspective of I want to provide answers that people can rely on and that they don't necessarily feel like they need to do outside sentiment analysis. Yeah, it's always useful to say, okay, does this graph make sense? Yes, it aligns with other things I know. But even beyond that, just to be able to rely on what's coming out. So we are seeing that already in production in enterprises today. And another thing that's interesting is that once people start seeing it and they see, okay, this thing is reliable, they start asking for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, another agent and another model and another agent and another model. They get the appetite grows. So at least from what I've been seeing, and obviously I'm biased here, but from what I've been seeing, the semantic approach is working well, and at least maybe the fact that there is a guardrail behind the scenes and there are semantics behind the scenes, maybe even that makes people feel more comfortable. Ben might say that not solely justifiable, so, but it makes them feel more comfortable trusting what they're seeing.
No,
Awesome.
I don't know how Waymo works. I do think I would be more comfortable if I was like there are two ways it could work. It could be just like it's all just like bitter lesson. Car drove around a bunch, figured out the rules of the road by like driving a bunch, and like we just fed it enormous amounts of video of cars driving, and it discovered what a stop sign was because cars stopped at a stop sign, and that's like its entire understanding of a stop sign is just like that seems to be the pattern. That may be how it works. I have no idea. Or it's like it actually was told if you identify this thing, that means stop. You need to stop. I am certainly more comfortable in the second case. Uh, but I don't know which one it is. But so long as it stops, I guess I can continue to believe that it like understands what a stop sign means, as opposed to seems like people stop at stop signs, therefore I will too.
But but Ben, would you have been the first person to ever sit in a Waymo ride that has no driver in the front?
No.
Okay.
No.
I think that's the difference.
Yeah. Like, yeah. But
Uh,
you know, like
I
like
wouldn't either, right? But the difference is okay, who is that person? I wonder who that person was who sat in the first Waymo ride that there was no driver to save them if
that was
anything happened. But
that was like on a road.
yeah, that was on a road, on a busy road in, let's say, San Francisco or Phoenix or whatever it was, but on a busy road. I wonder who that person was. I would not be that person. But, if I go back to our conversation, I am fine being the first person using a certain model to generate a report to a superior of mine if that model was vetted by somebody who knows the data, the data
Mhm.
analyst or whoever vetted the model.
I'm gonna pause you guys right now. We're gonna go into a quick lightning round because we have very little time left. It's ticking away. We have 13 minutes, and I want to give you guys a chance for a closing statement, but I want to hit audience Q&A before that. Real quick to break this up, we're gonna do a quick lightning round. So just make one choice, no additional dialogue. What's the more annoying AI trait? Confident hallucinations or the classic, you're absolutely right.
I hate that absolutely right.
What about you,
I
Ben?
hate that.
The
Like,
hallucinations.
right.
Tell me I'm great. By all
Yeah.
means, be sycophantic.
All right. What survives the apocalypse alongside the cockroaches? Traditional BI dashboard or the Excel spreadsheet?
Excel.
Yeah, I mean Excel. That seems
Yeah.
both are impossible to get rid of, but Excel more so.
Yeah.
You got to touch it. You got to touch the data.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. You got to pivot it. One more
Yeah,
VLOOKUP, please.
just where's the most used feature in every BI tool is like export to CSV.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
forever. Yeah.
It's going to be forever there.
Okay. And last one before we get into audience Q&A, which AI term needs to be retired? Copilot, because there's a million of them, or slop?
Retired.
Hmm. I think slop because the people who use it are like the most annoying. It's because
Yeah.
there is an inherent thing when you refer to stuff as slop that you're not doing it. It's like anybody who talks a lot about taste. It's like the thing they're really saying is yes, but I have it. And if anybody's like complaining about slop, like really what they're saying is yes, but not me. And that I'm over that.
Yeah. I actually I agree with that point. Yep.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'm gonna go to the audience Q&A. Give me just a second here. Take a look at a couple of these questions. Okay, yeah. So for each of these, let's do 30 seconds or so. And if you start going past that, I'm gonna cut you off because I want to make sure we can get to all of these. So, how do you ensure data governance in the YOLO approach? Ben, this is to you.
You don't like, I think you two things is one, you probably do stuff in repeated ways and like make sure the thing matches what you sort of some expectations. Uh, and two, I think it's like you change your expectations. It's like, how do you ensure governance on your Google searches? You don't like, you kind of have to learn to use it in a different way.
Okay, great. Yoni, is the industry over engineering semantic layers because data teams are uncomfortable with giving up control?
Potentially a bit. There's when you think about data teams giving uncomfortable giving control, data teams for many years were not well regarded or respected. Like there were the people who were responsible for the data. They usually did not get any kudos for anything that worked well, any data that was used successfully. No, usually nobody came back to them and said, "Oh, your data was amazing. Thank you. That really helped me." They were a punching bag. Whenever the data didn't make sense, people would go back to the data team and just say, "Oh, your data sucks." Whatever, right? So being in the data team, I can understand the reluctance to give up control because you're not just afraid of your political situation, etc. You're afraid that you start releasing it more and more, and you just become more of a punching bag. So I can understand that reluctance, and I think for a while, the data team will hold on to it. I think that data people have a right to have a seat at the table and to be part of the conversations, and maybe finally people will consult with the data team before doing all kinds of crazy things. So I think their desire to keep control is well founded in both history and then potential going forward.
One quick thing. I was just talking to someone last week, I think, who worked at her former employer was like a big public company. They were big Looker customers. They were trying to move away from Looker because like post Google, all that stuff. It's been a while now, but they were like evaluating Omni. They were evaluating some other BI tools. And one of the big reasons that they were like having a hard time with the decision was the team that owned Looker did not want to give up control of LookML. That like LookML is the Looker built-in semantic layer, was like if we change tools, then a new team will control the tool and a new team will have control of that semantic layer. And so like it was very much just a political fight about, it wasn't about which tool is better. It was like, if we keep the current tool, then we keep control of the way this thing works. And if we don't, then we don't, and we don't want to do that. And so, yeah, I think there's probably, especially at big enterprises, a lot of this like, it's like territory sort of political fighting of like who has control to what and who can do what and that kind of stuff.
Okay, this is an interesting one. And I bet you that if there's software development people out there, they might argue with this person. But I think it's a good point though. One way to frame the question: we've solved software development with AI. Again, that might ruffle some feathers depending on your opinion on that. What makes data analysis fundamentally more difficult in a way that requires human jurisdiction? That can beat either one of you.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, who is that going to?
Sorry.
My answer to this is what I said a minute ago, which is like it's this kind of black box thing. It's that software can be a black box. That we don't need to ever care how like software is built. We do like ultimately again, we can kind of like you think you do because it's like it needs to be secure and all that sort of things, but like you don't really like if it works, it works. Like that it is sort of a self-affirming thing that if software works, it works. If you test it enough, then it works. Data is not that. Like you can't test a chart. You can like again, you kind of can, but you can go like try it in the real. I can test Yoni's semantic layer trend search by like trying to look at a bunch of places. But all I'm trying to do is like reconfirm it from different angles. But there's no way to test that chart unless you like look at the code. And even then, like you can always imagine like, well, how do you know the data is right? How do you know the code that's recording the data is right? Like you can kind of go all the way back. But the point is, it's like there's something much more like you need to understand the internals more. And I think that makes it a much harder thing where you can't like tell Claude Code to do a thing, come back 20 minutes later, push the buttons and be like, yep, it looks good. Let's keep going. Like you come back later with a bunch of charts and what do? You're like, this makes sense to me is the best that you can say. Or you go read all the queries and you understand everything that's on and like stuff like that. And that makes it much harder, I think, to like rapidly vibe code in the way that you can software.
I want to add something to that. In the world of software, you have controls, right? We in production code, I'm not talking about my little cursor experiments on my computer. In production code, for example, in the solid actual production code, every change to the code requires human approval, a pull request or a merge request if you're in the GitLab world. There are controls in place to avoid the YOLOing and the AI slop or whatever to damage the production experience. There are humans in the loop. There are multiple steps along the way. You even have what's called CI, which means that every branch gets tested against hundreds or thousands of tests before it gets merged. So there are so many controls in the world of software development. And even if you are using Claude Code to write the code and you're using Claude Code to review your code, like some people are doing that, you still have humans in the loop and enough controls along the way to make this thing safe. In the world of analytics, no, somebody writes a report. There is no, there is a secondary review, but there is no, all those tests and all those processes in there, at least usually. And I think that's the other big differentiator. Until they come into the picture, maybe at that point that will change.
This is another thing actually about software and data. I think that's very different. That this is not related to. It's very related to what you're saying. It's not necessarily related to AI. Is data does not have a sense of production. Like it does if you have a semantic layer and this is your thing. Your DBT code, you have production versus not. But a lot of data work exists in this kind of like fuzzy half production state where it's like it's a report that I create that I give somebody that they make a decision on. They come back to it a month later. Is that thing in production? It's like, well, it kind of was. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it might have become outdated. Like it's sort of no longer in production the moment I like push the publish button because I'm saying it's done. Like, am I keeping it up to date? Absolutely not. Like everything is in this kind of like half state of production. And I think that makes it very hard to, where software has a very clear, like this is what is running versus this is all development work. It's like data has, there's a very small core of things that are running that are like a DBT project or a semantic layer or whatever. And then there's this whole world around it that's like stuff that went into production in the sense people made decisions on it, but like isn't maintained or is only lightly maintained or was built by someone who kind of didn't know what they were doing or was built by someone who did know what they were doing, but 6 months ago and now it's changed. It's like, it's a very weird, difficult system to manage in a way that software is not.
Okay, I'm going to cut you guys off here. So we got to get into our closing statements. I'm going to give you guys 90 seconds each to answer this question. So try to be snappy. Okay. Ben, this one's to you. What are people getting wrong about the future of AI and data?
I think it's going to change the way we use data a lot more than like we're applying AI to existing data workflows. I think like what we're trying to do right now is the sort of like we have data in one way that works. We use BI tools and we have analysts and we're writing queries and all that kind of stuff. And now we're trying to like sort of use AI to make that stuff faster. It seems to me that like that's a little bit weird. It's that like BI and a lot of BI and reporting work was done because we hired data teams to go off and do like crazy, find me novel insights and like haystacks of data and like do the things that change my business. We couldn't really find them. So we built a bunch of BI tools because that's kind of the thing that we could do instead was like make some dashboards and look at charts and like make some like operational reporting. We then have like decided to apply AI to do the same thing that we did. And I think actually like it'll cycle back around to where AI is a little better at like pushing the frontier, go find the needles in the haystacks, just like be an agent that runs all the time looking for interesting stuff. And so like that to me is a pretty different way of thinking about data than how we think about it today. But I think we'll get there. I think it's right now, it's just like when new technology comes out, you basically like stick it on to the old thing and then you realize what you can do that's novel and different. And I think we're very much in the stick it on the old thing phase. And I think in a few years we'll be on the like, what does this actually enable that was sort of fundamentally different from the way that we've been doing it before?
Great. Thanks, Ben. And Yoni, what are people underestimating about making AI actually work in enterprise?
If anything, I think people are overestimating. So there's Ben's approach of YOLO, etc., but 99.9% of people that I talk to in large enterprises they're not thinking like Ben. They're thinking like people have been thinking about for the past 10 years with semantic layers and everything. And I think what's happening is people see the massive amount of complexity in their enterprise data and their enterprise data platforms, et cetera. And they look at it and they hold their head and say, okay, this is terrible. AI is never going to understand what's happening here, where it's going to take us forever to get one agent off the ground in the first few use cases. And I think they're overestimating the amount of work. Yes, you need tools to help you, whether it's Solid or another tool, you need tools to help you. Doing it by yourself maybe is good for a POC, but not for production, I don't think. So you need a tool to help you. But I do think people are overestimating how hard it is. It is hard. It is very hard, maybe, but it's not impossible. And it's doable. And you can finish 2026 in a situation where you've got your semantics, you've got agents running on top of it, you've got business users using it, and maybe you've reached a point where no one is ever going to write a SQL query again in your company. And that's possible. That's completely attainable over the next 6 months. And I think that's so I kind of reverse your question, but that's my opinion.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you guys for doing this today. I mean, again, in the beginning, I thought there was going to be a lot more contention here. You guys ended up overlapping a lot, and I think it was a fantastic discussion. I want to thank our audience for attending the debate today. By the way, I did mention this in the chat, but if you did not get your question answered, we had so many great questions. Please email them to me, Zack, Z-A-C-K-M, @getsolid.ai, or send us a message on LinkedIn, and we will do our best to get those questions answered for you as well. So thank you everybody for attending today. This was great. Ben, Yoni, fantastic discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks,
Thanks, Ben. That was fun. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.